Okay, so I'm going to go over the differences between the version 1.3 and the 2.0 beta. By the time you see this video, the rulebook will be out already, so you'll be able to go download it. And then you'll see that I'm going to go over the main differences that I found when I went over the book the first time. I'm not going to go over every single difference because that would take forever, and so I'm going to not include the special rules and magical items. You can read those on your own. Those are very, very different. They did a major overhaul, so we're just going to be focusing on some of the main changes, alright? Okay, so models, units, and formations. Now the first change you'll see is that the number of models for full ranks doesn't depend on troop type, it depends on the model size, and that's because they did an overhaul of the troop type system. The troop types are gone. It's based on the model classification system, so every model has a type and a size. And so, for example, a giant wouldn't be a monster, it would be gigantic infantry. Alright, so I'll go over that next time when we go over the slide on the model classification system. And now you will see about the horde formation, and then there's a big difference. So now the line formation replaces it, and what it is you're not 10 wide anymore, you're 8 wide. So you only need 8 models to form a horde. It's called line formation. And you gain fight and extra rank, but the major change is that you're going to give up your static combat res of your rank bonus. So you're not getting any rank bonus. Rank bonus is 0, but that's going to allow you to gain those 8 extra attacks. So what this means is the elite units that have very high strength or hit very well, like elves, they're going to be receiving a major boost, whereas the core troops and like goblins or peasants, they're going to get nerfed by this, so it's not going to help them at all. So what's going to happen is you're going to have to place your goblins or rats in a bus formation. You're not going to have a choice. Keep in mind that if you had the idea of going horde and then going into a bus later on in the combat, you can't do that because in the combat reform you can't take models away from combat. The combat, so you can always go wider, but you can't go into a bus. So what this means is, yeah, you're gonna be forced to go into a bus. It's gonna help the elites, and I'm not sure the game really needed this to help the elite units. Now, why does it help elites and not the goblins and peasants? So I'm gonna explain it. So what you're doing is you're trading that static combat res of +3 for 8 extra attacks. But remember, the elites, they want to get as many attacks as possible because they hit really hard. But the core units, okay, the peasants and goblins, they don't hit hard at all, and they really depend on that static combat res. So it's an advantage to the elite units, alright, because they're going to be able to take advantage of that trade-off. They're sacrificing +3, but they're going to be able to gain at least 3 kills from those 8 extra attacks. If you do the math, most of the time they're going to get maybe 4 or 5 extra kills. So it's worth doing that, making that trade-off. But for those units at strength 3 who with shield, it's not going to help them whatsoever. We really need to have a rule like this for elite, but also another actual horde rule for peasants and goblins to actually help them in the combat, because maybe game them 2 times fight an extra rank. I don't think this is helping very much. It's just boosting elites essentially. Alright, let's go over now the general principles. Okay, so they added a whole new charge phase, so you're gonna have its own phase for that, and it just makes it clearer for players new to the game. Line of sight. Okay, so for line of sight, let's say you want to draw line of sight between models A and B. Now, the line of sight is not interrupted if the model that is between them, let's call it C, does not have a size equal to or greater than both the sizes of A and B. So for example, if you want a human to draw line of sight to the orc, and you have a goblin in between, they're all the same size, so you can't draw line of sight. So that is a big difference from the 1.3, because in the 1.3 you would just take hard cover, but not anymore, you just can't see at all. So you're going to have to make gaps for your shooting units, and remember, when you charge, you can only charge a unit that you see. So keep that in mind. I think it's gonna change the way we position our units. And also another change they made is that when you draw line of sight, you draw line of sight to the footprint of the unit, not the boundary rectangle. And in 1.3 you always use the boundary rectangle, but now I guess it's going to matter on which side we remove the casualties. To me, that was not necessary at all to make that change. Now it's a decision on which side we remove the models. Do we really need that level of granularity? To me, it's just a bit well, not really needed. Could have just kept it as boundary rectangle. Maybe there's something that I'm not seeing. Okay, so the troop types are gone. It's replaced by the model classification system. I'm going to go over that in a little bit more detail further on in this video. Okay, and this is another strange change that I found. You can no longer temporarily move off the board edge and then come back. Now in 1.3 you were able to make a wheel and just come back onto the board. So I guess now it's just an invisible barrier. You can't pass. This is a bit strange, I find. I don't know why they needed to do this. I guess you're just gonna have to reform, because in some cases you won't be able to wheel because the side of the board is blocking you. Kind of weird. Okay, characteristics. Now you're going to see they have completely redone the unit profile, and they've split it essentially. So you have the global, defensive, and offensive. So when it's not your turn, you're going to be looking mostly at the defensive, and when you're attacking, you're going to be looking at the offensive. And the global is mostly related to movement and leadership. It's now called discipline. All right. Also, advance and march rates are separate stats now, so it's not just double your move to march. So that's going to allow them to make some units that have march rates that are not double the move, like chariots. I was playing the Undying Dynasty chariots, and they were able to march 10 inches, and they only advanced 4 inches, so they don't have to have any special rules or anything. So that's gonna be easier to understand. Also, the characteristics can now go outside the range 0 to 10. Okay, it's kind of rare that happens, but that's good to know. And the priority of modifiers clarified. I'm guessing they had problems in some corner cases that they didn't know what modifier came first. So that's all. It takes about half a page in the rule book. So that's going to be very clear whenever there's a ruler argument. Alright, army list structure. The general does not have to be the character with the highest discipline. Now this is going to allow in the army list construction more option, because you're going to be able to have maybe a character that's very fighty, focused in combat, and he might also happen to have a good discipline value, but you won't have to use him as your general, which means if you lose him, then it's not as bad. You know, you don't lose an extra 200 points in the count at the end of the game. So you could equip him maybe minimal defense and just let him kill a bunch of models, and then if you lose him, it doesn't matter, he's not my general. Alright, so you're going to have a little bit more options when it comes to leading your army. Okay, pre-game sequence. So the terrain generation at the beginning of the game has changed, and this is not a very major change. I personally never use the terrain generation that was in the rule book. Because in tournaments the tables will already be set, alright, and I just use the terrain from the map pack that they had released on the website, which made for fair maps based on the deployment. I guess now they changed it. Hopefully it's improved, because I know the old one, some places on the board could never have terrain the way it was set up. It was a little bit strange the way they had it. So okay, let's see, new deployments, dawn assault and marching columns. Okay, so we're going to have these new deployments in addition to the other ones that we had. Dawn assault is essentially you can't deploy anything on the flanks except for cavalry and light troops, I believe. So you're going to be forced to put everything in the center, and that's going to help against people who like to go in the corner a lot. It's going to stop them from doing that, and you're going to be forced to go in the center. So you can't just do a castle and gunline you. Marching columns. Now that's the one where you have to deploy from left to right, and you can also deploy in ambush. And I tested this one once, and it was pretty interesting. There's some nice choices you got to make. based on which side your opponent chooses and how they deploy. You'll have to see for yourself once you test it. Secondary objectives, we have two new ones, Spoils of War and King of the Hill. Now, Spoils of War is essentially you gain loot, so you can pick up the loot, and if you're a big unit, you can move at normal speed with the loot, but if you're a small MSU unit, minimum sized unit, then you're slower. You can't go as fast, alright? So it's going to stop people from putting a lot of units out there to capture objectives. And King of the Hill is essentially, I played this one, you're going to pick a terrain feature anywhere on the board, and if there's no enemy units on it at the end of the game, that's your objective is complete. Also, now you choose your spells for your wizard, so you don't have to roll for them anymore, which is really, really nice. It's probably one of the best changes in this version. So you can plan your strategy around what spells you're going to have. You don't have to get bad luck by not rolling that Wrath of God or something like that, and you know, you're not going to be forced to have 4 spells to make sure you get that spell. It's a really, really welcome change. I think everyone's gonna appreciate this. And you declare your special. There's a specific step now where you declare special deployment, and it's after selecting spells. You're going to declare which units are ambushing and scouting. All right, so that's going to clarify it, because in the previous book it wasn't clear when you decided that. Okay, deployment. It's essentially the exact same, except for, like I said, there's the new deployment types that I explained. And there's also a small change. Each war machine counts as a drop for deployment. So if you have a lot of war machines, like maybe orcs and goblins, you're going to be able to use each bolt thrower to delay your deployment. So you're going to be able to see a bit more what your opponent's going to deploy. That's a small boost for those inexpensive war machines, I would say. All right, let's move on to charges. So there's a separate charge phase. And okay, so the first thing you're going to do in charge phase, you're going to test for the decimated units to remain unshaken. So what a decimated unit is a unit that is less than 25% of its starting number of wounds. They're now called health points. There's no more wounds, it's just health points. By the way, change of wounds to health points, it's going to eliminate the confusion of wounds dealt or wounds remaining. So okay, so health points is just how many wounds you have left. Alright, so what you're going to do, you're going to pass a leadership or discipline check for each of those units. And if you pass, then you can reform and you're good. And if you fail, then now you're shaken. And shaken, what that is a new sort of an in-between step of fleeing or you're fine. And what it is you're paralyzed, you're frozen, you can't do anything. And also you're at -1 to hit other units in combat, and other units have +1 to hit you. Alright, so that's huge. Charge move can now exceed 90 degrees. That's probably for some corner case reason that I have not seen. I don't know why they changed this. Failed charge move is reworked. So now what you're going to do, you're going to wheel your unit so that they face in a direction that is determined by the line that passes through the center of both units. Alright? And if you encounter an obstruction, like another unit or an impassable, something like that, then you just stop right in front of it, and you ignore the unit spacing rule. And the major change here is that if you fail a charge, that unit is now shaken. So what that's going to mean is, in theory, if you try a very crazy charge, like a Hail Mary, which in this game happens a lot because you have very little to risk. Right now in the 1.3, let's say you try a long bomb charge, because the reward is just so much greater than the risk, because you'd only move, I think 5 or 6, maybe 4 or 5 inches forward. If you're far away, that won't matter at all. Well, now what's going to happen is your unit's going to be shaken. And what I don't understand here is that they've made it so that the unit is shaken until the end of the player turn. So I don't understand where the -1 to hit and +1 to be hit comes in, because if it's until the end of your turn, then that means you're not going to be shaken when your opponent countercharges you. That's what I didn't understand. Maybe they will have changed that paragraph by the time it's released, but that's something that I don't really understand right now. Okay, so movement. So what you're going to see here is rallying. Normally you use half the discipline, if you're at less than a quarter, but now you don't count the number of models, you count the number of health points. And the reason for this, I think, is that there was some abusive ways of taking advantage of this rule. For example, if you had a unit of 2 models, like Yetis or something like that, then they would never have to rally at half leadership, because if you lose 1 model, you're still at 50%. So with this change, it's going to make a difference, all right? So let's say you lose 4 wounds on that unit, then it's 2 out of 6, still not enough. So let's say you have 1 Yeti left with 1 wound, then he will test at half his leadership, all right? Because it's counted on health points, not the number of models. All right, so when a unit rallies, they're now shaken. So frozen and -1 to hit, and +1 to be hit. So again, this is where I don't understand, because it's supposed to be until the end of the player turn. So I'm not sure how that's going to come into play. Good change here. So the displacement is measured center to center. So you know how moving light troops was an issue because nobody really knew how to measure it. It wasn't clear in the rules, because if you measured corner to corner or anything, so they clarified that now. Normally you're supposed to measure at the end of the move that no part of the model has moved more than twice its move. Well, now you have the march, okay, so you're going to use the march rate, but you measure that from the center of where it started to the center of the unit where it ends. So that's going to make it so much easier. You're just going to be able to pivot however you want, and you're just going to measure from the center, because when you pivot, let's say a rectangular model, you only measure from the center, all right? So that's just going to make everyone's life easier. Another good change here is the wheels. So we had this discussion quite some time ago that the wheels were kind of broken in the game, because you're supposed to measure the arc somehow. Without a calculator or tables, you can't measure the arc, all right? So what they've done is now you don't measure the arc of the wheel. You're going to measure the straight line from the corner to where you start the wheel to when you end the wheel, and it's limited at 90 degrees, okay? And the reason for that is if you make a wheel of, let's say, 350 degrees, then you would only be moving, maybe a quarter of an inch. Okay, so that doesn't make any sense. So what they're going to do is you're going to be limited to 90 degrees per wheel. And then if you want to keep wheeling, you have to make a second wheel and measure again. So that's going to minimize the percent error when you measure the wheel, all right? Of course, very wide units are going to be able to take advantage of that. Wide units making a 90-degree wheel are going to be able to really take advantage of this rule. Okay, the magic phase. So the major change of this edition. And this, I think everyone's going to really appreciate this, because the old magic phase, all right, it was very, very swingy. So you could invest a lot in magic and then get very poor dice, and then your investment would go out the window. So it would affect your entire plan of your game. And some people might like that and say, oh, it's magic, you know, it's random, it's not supposed to be consistent. Well, you're going to be disappointed, because now the magic is much more consistent, and you're going to be able to plan for it and make your army based on it, and have a strategy coming into the game and actually be able to rely on it. So it's not random like in the old Warhammer game. It's there is some randomness, but it's more controlled, okay? So let's get into it. So you have 3 wizard types now: apprentices, adepts, and masters. Now, the apprentice knows 1 spell, and remember, you choose your spells at the beginning of the game. So you choose your path in your army list, but you can choose your spells based on your opponent, or based on the units that you see that he's bringing. And yes, the apprentice, he knows 1 spell, and he doesn't channel or anything, and he doesn't get any bonus to cast, alright? That's all he does. Now, the apprentice, he can choose between spell number 1 and spell number 2, and the hereditary spell. Now, the hereditary spells are spells that are unique to each army book. So it's a spell that any wizard can swap out for any of his spells in any scenario, alright? So you're going to be able to always use that for any spell that you chose. And the apprentice can take from spell number 1, spell number 2, or the hereditary. Now, the adept, he can choose between spells 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the hereditary spell. but there's a limit. He cannot choose spells number 1 and 4, and he gets to choose 2 spells. So he could choose, for example, Hereditary and spell number 2, or spell number 1 and the Hereditary, or spell number 2 and 4, but he would not be able to choose the spell number 1 and 4. And he does not channel either. Oh, actually, he does channel. He does channel, but he doesn't get any modifier. Now the Master can choose between spells 1 to 6 and the Hereditary spell, but cannot pick number spell 1 and 6. So these limitations here, they're going to make sure that you can't have just the 2 best spells. So they're probably going to take the most powerful spells and put them as number 1, 4, and 6, I believe. And the Master also has a +1 to cast and dispel. And he channels, of course. Now I'll explain channeling later. Now, they've removed the remains in play spells. There weren't that many anyways, and they were kind of a pain to deal with. Magic Flux. Okay, so let's explain the Magic Flux. So instead of rolling 2 dice now, you're going to roll a d8, or you're going to pick from a deck of cards. You're going to draw a card at random. There's going to be 8 cards, all right? And it's always the same cards each game. And there's 2 pieces of information on that card. The number of Veil tokens you get, and the number of dice that both players get. So let's say I pick a card that says 5 and 2. So both players would get 5 dice, and I would get 2 Veil tokens. And the Veil tokens, you can swap them out for dice at a rate of 3 Veil tokens to 1 dice. And remember when I talked about channeling for the wizards before? Well, what it does is for each channel, you gain a Veil token. So you can build your list around channeling, let's say, 4 Veil tokens per turn. So you're going to have that, you're going to be sure to have at least those 4 Veil tokens each turn. So you know, you have a little bit more certainty of how many dice you're going to get, all right? And the dice that are on these cards are not crazy, like a 6 and a 6, like in the old Magic phase. You would get sometimes 12 dice, sometimes you get 2. Well, now it's a bit more controlled, all right? So it varies, I think, from 5 to 9. Channel system replaced by Siphon the Veil, that's what it's called. You gain Veil tokens, all right? And let's see, Fizzle. Okay, so what Fizzle does is when you miss, when you cast and you miss, or when you want to dispel and you fail, what it is if you roll a 1 in those cases, you get to keep that in your reserve. So let's say I want to cast a spell with 4 dice and I roll 3 1s. I get really unlucky. Then I'm going to take those dice and I'm not going to lose them. I'm still going to have them to cast my next spell. And what that does is it mitigates the bad luck a little bit. So let's say you chose a good amount of dice to cast a spell, but you just got really unlucky. It's going to prevent that from happening. But remember, if you cast with just 1 dice, the Fizzle doesn't work, alright? Casting and dispelling and never exceed ±2. Now remember, the only modifier out of the box is the Master, who gets +1. No other wizards get that. So it's going to make it a bit simpler, but also the casting values have been reduced to compensate. And also the spells have been switched around in terms of position in the spell table for each of the paths to take into account for the limits on number 1 and 6 or 1 and 4 like I talked about before. Overwhelming power and lost focus, those things are removed because we don't need that because there's a totally new miscast system. So in miscast, it happens on any triple, and it can be a triple of any number. Okay, so that's where the randomness comes in. You could roll 3 1s or you could roll 3 5s, and the higher the number, the worse effect it gets. And if you roll with 3 dice, then you subtract by 1 in the table, so it gets better for you. If you use 5 dice, then it gets 1 effect worse. And to me, I've looked at the effects of the miscast table, and I'm not going to go over it in this video because it would take too long, but it's much more forgiving, okay? So it happens less often, and it's also more forgiving. But to compensate, the most powerful spells in each path have been toned down, so the overall effect of this is you'll notice the magic is much more consistent. Okay, it's consistent, but it's not you're not getting lucky on the Wrath of God and killing the army. And you know, you used to be able to, on the miscast table, as long as you didn't roll that 4 up, your caster wouldn't die. So you could just throw 5 dice at Wrath of God and eventually get lucky. Well, it's not quite the same anymore. So I know if you roll 5 dice and you roll 3 6s, your caster is automatically dead. That's one of the effects that I know off the top of my head. Okay, let's get into bounce spells. So the way bounce spells work is it's a bit different, alright? So you're not going to have to roll any dice to cast a bounce spell. You just choose to remove either 2 or 3 magic dice. And based on what you choose, you automatically have a certain casting value. So if I choose, let's say, 2 magic dice, I will have automatically a 4. So the defender will have to get at least a 4 to dispel my spell. And this is called the power level of the bounce spell. So if it's power level 4/8, that means if I use 2 dice, then you need to match a 4. If I remove 3 dice, then you need to show an 8 on the dice to beat it. All right, and there's no more +1 to dispel bounce spells. Okay, let's get into shooting. So there's no more ballistic skill. All right. So what it's going to be is each model will have an aim value associated with the weapon that it can shoot. Okay, so what that means is a model would be able to have 2 different weapons that have different aim values. So in the previous game, you had the same ballistic skill no matter what weapon you fired. Well, now you're going to have that extra level of granularity. For example, you could have an ogre crossbow and a brace of pistols, and the brace of pistols could be 3 up and the crossbow 4 up, for example. So it allows them to fine-tune a little bit more. And as well, you'll notice the old names are gone. There's no more BS, it's aim. Same with a lot of these names, they're all getting renamed, like leadership is now discipline, inspiring presence is commanding presence, etc. 2 hit penalties for shooting at skirmishers or multiple shots removed. So that's going to be good for, let's say, those dread elves who like to do those multiple shots a lot. And it's going to allow them to hit a bit more consistently. And skirmishers are going to be able to be hit same as everyone else. The point at which the line of sight is drawn is chosen by the owning player. So you can choose at what point on the model's base you draw the line of sight, because based on which corner you choose, that's going to allow you to see more or less of the unit. So it's just clarifying that it's the owning player who chooses. All right. Now the line of sight you draw to the footprint, not the boundary rectangle. So I don't like this change. It means you're going to have to keep track of, oh, which side of my unit should I remove my models from in order to not be shot. And it's just something I don't want to have to think about when I'm removing my models. I just want to remove them. I don't want to think about which side should I remove them on. That's a bit silly to me. Okay, this is a bit strange because they have made it so that when you charge, you have to make sure that the boundary rectangle is within the front arc of the unit that is charging. So when you charge, you use the boundary rectangle, but when you shoot, you use the footprint. Now, I don't know why they did this. There's got to be some obscure reason for it, but I just don't see it. Just make it the boundary rectangle for both, please. That would make much more sense, unless there's something I'm not seeing. Now, hopeless shots, that's a new rule, and what it is explaining how you determine when a model needs to hit on a 7, for example, or an 8. Well, you can't do it on the dice, so what it is when you hit on a 7, you need a 6, and then you need a 4+, and then you need, for an 8, you need a 6, and then a 5 up, etc. And it's just explaining how those modifiers work when you combine them with other modifiers. Alright, melee. It's not called combat anymore, it's called melee. So, charging models gain +1 agility, and this is huge. Now remember, agility is the new name for initiative, okay? It's not called agility. And this is really, really great because it gives a major boost to models that charge, especially knights, okay? Knights are really good on the charge, but it's going to help them swing first. They're going to swing before the unit that is defending, especially if they're elves, you know? And this is really needed. I mean, the +1 to charge, most of the time it wasn't even worth it, especially on glass cannon units. It just move them up and force the issue instead of charging. You really didn't need to charge. +1 in combat doesn't mean anything for elite units anyway. Now the weapon skill got replaced, it got split, okay, in offense and defensive skill, and it works in a similar way, but you're going to use a different value based on if you're attacking or defending. And this is great because it allows the designers to give a different value for different units. So I know to a lot of frenzied units, they changed it to where they're hitting better, but they're getting hit more often in return. So they'll have, let's say, offensive skill 3 and defensive skill 2. And you'll notice the table has changed. So now units can hit on 2+ as long as their offensive skill is much higher than the defensive skill. And same the other way, you can now have to hit on 6+ if your offensive skill is much lower than the defensive skill of what you're trying to hit. So that's going to really help characters go into units and protect them from getting hit by goblins and things like that. And allow him to just do more damage. It's going to prevent the the Demon Prince whiffing all his attacks because he needed 3+ and he rolled 4 2s or something. So this is good, I think. Let's see, +1 for charging from hill removed, and this is kind of a minor effect. Usually it didn't matter, especially for big combats. So they're just going to go ahead and remove this, but don't worry, it's going to be replaced by another change that we're going to go over in a next slide when I go over terrain. Line formation, yes, you cannot receive the rank bonuses. So we already talked about this, how you have to trade your rank bonuses to be able to get 8 extra attacks, and how it's beneficial for elite units and not for cheap units like goblins or peasants. Pursuits and flees, they're not performed center to center anymore, so you're always going to go straight forward like overruns. So that's going to make it more consistent. You're not going to have to worry about when you charge, how should I maximize in order to make him flee a certain way. It's just going to make it much cleaner, and you're just going to have to worry about side to side what you're going to hit first when you pursue. That's what's going to matter. But you're always going to flee 180 degrees from where you were facing. All right, you're not going to flee on a slight angle to the left or to the right. This is good, I think. It was causing some slight problems. It was sometimes difficult to determine which angle they were fleeing and things like that. So I really like this change. Strength and armor piercing are now split. So previously, if you had +1 strength, you would also penetrate the armor by 1 more point. But now it's split. So what this does is it's going to allow the designers to give a model high strength but low AP, or high AP but low strength. So it's just one more stat change that's going to allow them to create different units. So it's going to help the balance as well. And so, for example, now you don't have a strength 6 ogre with a great weapon, you'll have a strength 6 and AP 3 ogre. Alright, so it increases the complexity, but it allows them more design space, because now they can have, for example, spells that have strength 6 but in armor penetration 0. Okay, so knights or armored units are going to be good against that spell, but not monsters, things like that. Right? Okay, psychology. So heavy casualties, remember that's when you get shot at and then you have to take a check if you lose enough health points. Well, now it's determined by the health points, not the models, similar to decimated. All right. I'm going to explain why that's good, because of the, let's say you could have a unit of 2 models, for example, it wouldn't work. And yes, they added the shaken rule, which is a huge change. It's gonna make units really suffer if they miss a charge. All right, that's good. Like, let's say you really want that lung bomb charge. Well, you're gonna have to weigh the risk now. It's not gonna be so weighted in terms of the reward and not the risk. All right, victory conditions. So what we have here is a lot of changes. So the decimated units, it's counted by the number of health points, not models. So you know how at the end, if a unit was decimated, well, now you count the wounds, not the models. And this is good. So for example, an ogre dart of 3 ogres, then they would never count for decimated, because they would always have at least 1 ogre left, which is 1/3 of the 3 ogres. Well, now you count the wounds, not the models, so they're gonna give up points like that. All right. Hold the ground. Now the players gain points every turn, starting on turn 2. Now, if you've played this game for some time, you'll notice if you've played Hold the Ground a lot, what happens is that there's like a Mexican standoff, sort of shuffled forward a bit, maybe there's a few combats on the flanks, and then on turn 5 and 6, everyone bum rushes the objective at the end. And this is really gonna force, it's gonna motivate the players to push their units towards the center of the table the whole game. So you're gonna fight over the objective the whole game, not just right during the last 2 turns. I think this is good. Capture the flags. The player with the lowest number of scoring units that are dead wins. So you're not going to have to go after the scoring units of the opponents of your opponent. And what you're going to have to do is just make sure that the units that your opponent chooses are not dead at the end. All right. So you're just going to have to go ahead and protect those units. Now, breakthrough. The number of scoring units are capped at 3. Okay, so any unit can score, but if you go ahead and take 5 units and put them in the deployment zone, then it only counts for a maximum of 3. All right, so what that's going to do is limit the MSU spamming of small units to gain the objective, and that's a good thing because we don't want this game to turn into only MSU is valid, is viable. We want also some big blocks. So maybe if someone takes 3 big blocks, that's going to be just have the same chance as the other player with the MSU. All right. Spoils of War and King of the Hill. So these I already went over. So Spoils of War is you grab the loot and then you run around and try to keep it. King of the Hill is you choose a terrain feature, and if there's no enemy units on it at the end of the game, you gain that objective. Alright, so let's go over model classification now. So each model has a size and a type. So there's 3 different sizes and 4 different types, so that means there's 12 possible combinations of size and type. So there's 3 sizes: standard, large, and gigantic. And the 4 types are infantry, beast, cavalry, and construct. So like I gave before, the example of a monster, like a giant, is now an infantry, and he's gigantic, so it'd be a gigantic infantry. Monstrous cavalry doesn't exist anymore, so it would probably be a large beast, or a large cavalry, alright? And you could have a large infantry, like ogres would be large infantry. So what this means is they're going to be able to have more combinations of rules. So standard, large, and gigantic refers to rules like the number of models you need for full ranks. So the number of models you need for full ranks depends on your size now, right? And also how many you need for supporting it, how many supporting attacks you get, and how many DTs you take, and if you have stomps or if you have towering presence or terror. The type just tells you if you have swift stride or if you can be stomped. And cavalry also have the tall rule, where if they are the same size then as infantry, then they can see over because they're a bit taller. All right. Okay, terrain. Now they added this piece of terrain called chasm, which is really awesome. I'm going to explain to you what it is. It's very simple. It's exactly like an impassable, except it doesn't block line of sight. Yep. Imagine that. So it's just sort of a pit, an abyss, essentially, where you can fire arrows over it or shoot across it. You can see perfectly fine, but you just can't go over it. You can't touch it in any way. And this is really cool. It's going to offer some different strategies and a bit more variety instead of just impassables all the time. So we're going to be able to model some different piece of terrain here. That's looking forward to that. Fields no longer cause DTs and flammable, so that's another boost to cavalry and chariots. Units charging from a hill can reroll failed charge rolls, and this is really cool. So imagine you have cavalry on a hill, you'll have swift stride, and you reroll it. That's going to just be really, really, really great. So it's going to make you want to take your units and put them on a hill, and they'll just have a threat range of that consistency in charging. All right, so you're probably going to give them a movement banner, and they're going to be able to charge anything they want. All right, so water now causes DTs to models of standard size that are on foot. So you're gonna have to check to see if you drown. Interesting that cavalry don't take this this DT. And you lose steadfast as well, so you can't hold your ranks in the water. And also no flaming attacks can work in the water. Alright. Walls cause DT2 on constructs now, instead of DT1 before on chariots. Also, to defend the wall, the unit must have at least half the front facing in contact with the wall. So you can't just go a little corner against the wall and say that you're defending the wall. It doesn't work, okay? And also now, when you're defending a wall, you gain distracting for all the combat rounds, not just the first combat round. This is going to give a real boost. It's going to make you want to defend the wall more than in the 1.3, because you're going to gain that boost during the whole combat. And here is where I start to face palm, because they have added rules for entering buildings, and this I don't really like. I gotta admit, I haven't tested playing with this, because back in the previous edition, I think 0.99, they had this, and I just never even read it, never played with it, because I had no interest in going inside a building. It didn't really, you know, to me, this is not a skirmish game. It's a game of big battles. So why are you adding skirmishing rules in here? You know, this isn't Mordheim. So the explanation for how to garrison a building is one entire page long in the rulebook. So I mean, I don't know what else to say, guys. This is it's not for me. All right, so you're gonna have to test it out and see if you like it, but it's just not my cup of tea. All right, let's go to command group. So now when you have march to the beat, it no longer stacks. So you can't just surround someone with multiple units and stall him and stop him from marching. So it only counts once. I never even thought of this abuse before, but I guess some people did this. There's no more veteran standard bearer, because the magical item or artifact system has been completely reworked. So this doesn't work anymore. The stand behind rule has been added. Now what this is that you can have first in the rank rule for characters and command, but it says that if you have characters, they have priority over the command group to go in the front rank. So this really affects the ogres, because what I used to do is hide some characters in the second rank. And now you're not going to be able to do it anymore. You're going to have to put them in the front rank, even if you have the command group. So, like for example, I used to put my shaman in the second rank and put the command group in the front rank and have 3 wide. That's not going to be possible anymore. And this is nice, but you know, at least they give us some rules to make our shaman more fighty, more survivable in the combat. So this is good. I think it's a bit less abusive. Okay, let's go over weapons and armor. So barding no longer reduces movement, and I noticed what they've done is they've simplified the movement when you have barding. So I remember for Pegasus Knights, it was kind of confusing what movement they actually had, because they were flying and also they had barding, and their unit entry was just confusing to me. And now it's just much simpler to read. All right, and barding doesn't have that penalty anymore. Paired weapons, instead of granting +1 attack and +1 initiative, it gives +1 attack, +1 offensive skill, and it ignores parry. Now this is really important for the ogres, because with ogres I used to love having more initiative, because I love to hit first with the smaller units. Well, now it's different. You ignore parry, and you're going to gain an extra offensive skill as well. Spears now, they grant fight an extra rank like they did before, and armor piercing, but if it was charged and only in the front, they gain +2 agility and +1 armor piercing in the first round. So if a unit of knight were to charge a big unit of spears, then they would have +2 armor piercing against the knights and +2 agility, so they might even get to hit before the knights. And remember, the knights do get the +1 agility for charging. But still, this might make a difference, especially since, I mean, I guess they lost the lethal strike against cavalry. That was a little bit unfair. So this is going to work against anyone, infantry, cavalry, but I think it's still especially good against cavalry because of the armor piercing. So spears are really good in this version, I think. I guess as long as they're not flank charged. All right, so this is the key bit. All right, let's go over artifacts. So this one's going to be really quick. I'm not going to go over every single artifact because there's just too many of them. I could make a video just for that. But it's been essentially completely redesigned. Okay, the army book artifacts and the big rule book artifacts completely start from scratch, and they're all brand new. And the system is different as well. So you have 4 types: weapon enchantments, armor enchantments, banner enchantments, and charms. And you can take one weapon enchantment. So what you're going to do on your character, you're going to buy him a mundane weapon, and then you're going to buy the weapon enchantment for it. And you can take up to 1 weapon enchantment. So it's the same thing with armor enchantments, but armor enchantments, some of them are specific to light armor, some of them specific to heavy armor. And if it just says suit of armor, it means on any type of armor, essentially. So you can buy your character light armor and then buy him a light armor enchantment. Or you can buy him heavy armor and buy him a heavy armor enchantment. And the banner enchantments, you can take a banner enchantment on the unit if it tells you you're allowed. And also the BSB can now take 2 banner enchantments, but if he does, he can't take any other artifact. And the charms, you can take up to 2 charms, okay? And if any item is dominant, that means the character cannot take any other item that is dominant. That's what dominant means. And that's going to bring us to the end of the video. And you'll notice I haven't talked about the specific artifacts or any of the special rules. Now there's an entire section on special rules, like a bunch of special rules change, like volley fire and frenzy. So you're gonna have to go read that for yourself, because including in this video would have made it way too long. So I hope you enjoyed this overview of what changed. Hopefully you found some differences that you didn't know about if you were already familiar with most of the changes. If you're coming over from a previous edition, it's going to be a little bit more challenging to understand because you haven't played the 1.3. But the game essentially plays the same way as it did before. It's the same feel of the game. Just the magic is much more consistent. And again, you have those shaken units, right? So you're going to have to make sure if you want to try that low probability charge that it's really worth it. So my overall opinion of this new edition is pretty positive. I think a lot of the changes are very good. Just a few quirks here and there that I'm not a fan of, like the boundary rectangle issue. But overall, it's just fixes a lot of the problems we've been seeing. We'll still have to playtest the artifacts and all the special rules, because that comes with practice, as well as the list building. So I just wish they would have looked or taken a look at the issue with the steadfast block and then charging in with like a monster to the side. A lot of the time it's not worth doing, because the peasant or goblin brick just bleeds too much combat res, and then you end up losing the combat, and then the monster will flee, especially now since a lot of the monsters lost stubborn. That was sort of a band-aid to stop that, but now that that's gone, I don't know how that's going to work, especially undead. Undead just crumble, all the skeletons die, and then the the Shaptis or the Sphinxes just crumble from that. So I wish they would fix that, maybe resolve the combat individually for each unit. That would increase the complexity, but at the same time probably be more fair. So I'm going to tell you guys my top 5 changes for the new rules. Number 5, I'm going to go with the shaken units. So this is really offers us another layer of strategy. We're going to be able to weigh the risk versus reward when we declare a charge, and it's going to allow us to have a third state of psychology in the game. Number 4, I'm going to go with charging, giving +1 agility. It's a really good incentive to actually make that charge. Alright, for number 3, I'm going to go with the split of strength and armor piercing. This is a really good change. It's going to allow for more balance and I think a greater diversity of units. Number 2, I'm going to go with the split of offensive and defensive skill. There's no longer just one weapon skill, and that's going to make it really apparent when a unit is very good at hitting but bad at taking hits. And for number 1, I'm going to have to go with the new magic. Not so much the flux system of the cards, but my favorite is the ability to choose spells for your army, and that's going to really allow us to find new strategies and combinations for in the list building phase. I also really like the Veil token system, and I forgot to mention it in the video, but you can actually store up to 3 Veil tokens for your next magic phase, so that'll allow you to supercharge your Veil tokens, make sure you have up to the max. When it really matters in that vital combat, you'll have your full magic phase, and it'll ensure you have more dice than your opponent. All right. I'm going to give an honorable mention to the way we measure light troops. It's now center to center, so it's much easier. We don't have to worry about corners or anything like that. They can pivot as many times as they want. You measure their total displacement from the center of the unit to the center of the unit where it ends up. I also really like the change to how we measure wheels. It's now much easier. You don't need a math degree to be able to measure it. So that's all I gotta say about this time. Again, if you noticed I made any mistakes about the rules, just make sure you leave a comment, and if you have any questions, you can also let me know. And please tell me if you if I made a mistake, or if there's for some reason I didn't see. Like, I would like to know the thing about shaken units until the end of the player turn. If someone could give their what they think their explanation for that is, and that would be awesome. All right, I'll see you on the next video.